The day she met the man who wouldn't submit to her authority began like every other day in her life that should have been identical to the last. With precision, with plan, with an invisible orbit of assistants and schedules colliding to hold the world in place. But that morning, the world she knew, glass, marble, the crisp bite of an Italian suit, stopped short at a chain-link fence and a sheet of plywood flapping in the wind. Paola Andrade stepped out of a black SUV like a verdict. Her heels bit into the gravel, not the polished marble of boardrooms or the soft carpet of private jets. The soles sank half an inch into dust that clung to the leather. A gust stole the scent of her perfume, expensive jasmine and something metallic, from the air and replaced it with the honest, abrasive odor of fresh cement and diesel. For a heartbeat, she felt dislocated, a foreign agent dropped into a scene she had commissioned and assumed she owned. The construction site was a chorus of noise, men shouting over engines, the steady clank of rebar, the drone of a cement mixer chewing through gray paste. A skeleton of a mansion rose like a statement against the sun, scaffolding leaning into the sky, scaffolding that would, in her mind, soon be wrapped in glass the color of champagne. Her name was attached to that future in steel and stone. She could sign it, and the world would bend. "Paola," said Lucas, one of her aides, voice thin with the kind of bark reserved for checklists. "Everything's on schedule. We thought this would be a quick visit. You can meet Marcos, he's the foreman. Show me," she said. Her words were the kind that authorized things. They opened doors and accounts and sometimes hearts. She was used to seeing people move, to being met with the reflexive deference that wealth had taught others to offer. She expected the men here to step to attention, to polish their deference with a smile. Instead, a man in a weathered hard hat tilted his chin and kept his hands where they were, raw and steady on the wheelbarrow handles. He was salt of the earth in the precise way that made the city's velvet fade around him. Calluses carved his palms like small maps. His boot tongues were packed with dirt. He looked up, met her gaze without the practiced bow she'd seen her life imitate. For a moment there was nothing between them but wind and the hum of the sight. And then he offered a nod that was not exactly polite and not exactly rude. It was just a nod, as if meeting her might be business as usual. "Ms. Andrade," Lucas began, performing the ritual. Marcos Silva looked at him like someone interrupting a private joke. "You look like a woman who's got plans," he said, voice low and grainy from sun and work. He didn't use the formalities her assistants had rehearsed. He didn't say ma'am. He said what he saw. Plans. "You've got blueprints. You've got people who read blueprints. That's good." Paola's lips thinned. "We need the north wing to match the renderings," she said. "I expect communication, safety briefings twice a day. No excuses." His hands didn't stop moving. "We'll build what's on the drawings, but this place runs on more than plans. Tell whoever draws those renderings to talk to the crew more. Fancy drawings don't teach you how to pour a foundation that stays dry next rain." There it was, the first small revolt, a refusal to be ordered by the notion of authority itself. Not open defiance, not a theatrical stand, just a quiet, internalized code that didn't bend when a name meant millions. Paola's assistant prodded her with a look that said, "Smooth this out, take charge, make him understand." Paola had spent a life learning how to smooth things, to make rough iron gleam. She could sign people into places. She could make them worry about logos and quarterly profits. The reflex that answered a challenge was immediate, a slow tightening behind the eyes. "Marcos," she said, the name tasting different on her tongue when addressed to a real person rather than a ledger. "I expect professionalism, respect for timeline, and—" "I don't take orders from people who've never set a block," he interrupted, not unkind, only blunt. "Respect is earned on this site, not given by a letterhead." Something in her wanted to correct him, to remind him of the money behind the letterhead, to tell him that her expectations weren't negotiable. Instead, she found herself stepping forward, the heels she had favored for morning meetings inconvenient and absurd here, and more than annoyance flared, surprise, an odd thrill. She had never been quite so challenged in a sentence. When the helmet handoff happened, it was small and perfectly ordinary, a foreman's courtesy, the exchange of a hard hat from supervisor to visiting VIP. Marcos, however, slid a helmet toward her with fingers that left a dusty smear on its rim. He didn't lower his eyes. He didn't snap it at the exact right angle to be deferential. He offered it like a tool might be offered to someone who would use it. The gesture felt intimate because it acknowledged her as someone who might have to act as well as command. Paola, not used to being handed tools, tightened her grip on the helmet as if it were a foreign object. She put the helmet on for the sake of the photo op. It sat wrong against her hair. Dust ghosted across the designer collar of her coat. She was aware, almost annoyingly, of the contrast. Nails filed to a soft square next to the wedge of his thumb, his hands a map of small injuries. She swallowed the impulse to smooth her hair. For all the rehearsed caused by her team, the man watched her as if he were cataloging something other than status. The first brush of hands was not between them. It was between Marcos and a girl no older than 6, darting between scaffolding legs to chase a sunbeam. Luia had a laugh like a bell, and a courage that was mostly learned from running where adults told her not to. She carried a plastic lemonade cup and a backpack that was half too big. The sun made her a small comet of energy, and then a wheelbarrow careened toward the edge of the site, metal clanking. A plank shifted. A man shouted. A loose bolt tumbled, skittered toward where Luia stood. One breath. In the blink between a shout and a crash, Marcos moved. He pushed through the cluster of men with the economy of action that comes from muscle memory and fear trained into swiftness. He scooped Luia up as if she were the most obvious and vital thing in the world. He didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. The barrow skimmed by them, wood whispering, a fracture of sound that could have been a scream. Paola felt her body drop into a new kind of attention. For a moment she could not reconcile the man who saved a child with the man who wouldn't bow to her. The world that was usually binary, her and everything else, split. Luia's lemonade sloshed, damp droplets catching on Paola's shoe. The small chaos smelled of citrus and dust and something human beyond the gloss of her life. "Are you all right?" she heard herself ask, and the question surprised her by how weak it sounded. Marcos set Luia down with a tremor in his arms that anyone who'd raised a child would recognize, not from fear but from relief that the child was whole. He looked at her, and in that look there was a steadiness she had not encountered before, something not easily bought or commanded. "She's fine," he said. "You shouldn't stand in places you can't control." His voice was not a reprimand. It was a fact, like a weather report. That afternoon, in the trailer where the project manager kept blueprints and stale coffee, Paola sat on a vinyl chair next to a table scarred by coffee rings and cigarette burns. She held a paper cup, suspicious of the heat. Marcos stood in the doorway, shoulders broad beneath a high-visibility vest, watching with an expression that might have been curiosity. The room was small and smelled like glue and late lunches. A poster on the wall advised safety in primary colors. "Come on," Lucas said, trying to nudge them into a staged conversation that might be photographed and then turned into investors' reassurance. "Talk about the plan. Show her how you'll protect the schedule." Marcos would give them no photograph. He rolled his shoulders, shrugged, and then, in a move that felt like more honesty than any sentence, he offered his coffee thermos. The metal was dented. He unscrewed the lid and handed it over in passing, no flourish. Paola laughed before she knew she'd laughed, quick and self-conscious. They moved to a diner across the street where the booths were vinyl and the coffee was strong enough to have an opinion. Paola took in the linoleum and the jukebox in a way that should have been dismissive, and yet she found herself watching Marcos as he navigated small talk with the ease of someone who had never needed applause. And that ease was as attractive as any compliment she had commanded. He held the chair for her, just a small courtesy, sliding it back with a surety that made the world feel balanced for a second. She sat, crossed one leg, felt a smear of dust on the back of her calf. Luia tucked into a plate of pancakes with the freedom of someone whose world gave her permission to be messy. At one point, Paola reached for the sugar and their fingers brushed. The contact was brief but literal, a spark caught in a mundane gesture. Neither moved to pull away. "This isn't usually my scene," Paola admitted, saying the words more to herself than to him. She watched how he watched her without the measurement she was used to. There was no ledger in his gaze. "You don't have to pretend you're any one thing here," Marcos said. "Just be you." She could not remember who she had been when she was not performing. She had been a child who was taught to command, who learned that the easiest way to be safe was to be in control. Pain, she had learned early, comes less often when you move first. But for the first time in years, the idea of not commanding every scene felt less like weakness and more like a query. After the diner, they walked back to the site. Paola's hand found the chain-link fence by habit, fingertips trailing on the cool wire. Marcos pointed to where the foundation would be laid the next day. He explained in short sentences that were not simplifications but choices, what the crew worried about. Drainage, the depth of the fill, the way the region's late rains could be a problem if the gravel wasn't compacted in the right sections. He said it plainly, neither protesting nor praising. She noticed the soft burr on his lower lip, where he had bitten into a blistering day. He didn't ask for her money. He asked for attention, time, and the ability to be believed. He was not opposed to her power. He recognized the shape of it, and met it with something else. An insistence on being treated as a person whose work was not a favor, but a craft. He didn't demand she step down from being who she was. He demanded she be accountable to him in ways that money could not answer. That night, Paola lay in a bed that felt too quiet, lit by an aggression of lights that would have been comforting in boardrooms, yet felt momentarily foreign in the dark. She found herself thinking not of the next meeting or the next signature, but of Marcos's hands on Luia when he had lifted her from danger, of the way he handled a helmet like it was a possession he entrusted to no one. No, not like that. Like it was an ordinary object he expected others to be capable of using. She told herself it was curiosity, primitive and inconvenient and fleeting. She told herself that whatever the pull was, it would be absorbed by schedules and meetings. Still, when she walked past the mirror in her hallway, the woman who looked back at her seemed smaller, as if there were a courtyard inside her chest where something had been unlocked. A week passed with a rhythm that made the days taste like cement. Paola spent more mornings at the site than she had planned, each visit an act of scholarship in which she learned not just the technical names, but the ways a team breathed together. She watched as men and women moved like a body trained to anticipate one another. She heard the small joke about the foreman's old boots and the earnest correction on a rivet placement. Marcos always seemed to be in the right place at the right second. He had a language of work that translated into care, tapping the platform to test weight, squinting at lines to see if they were true, hands moving as if drawing invisible margins in the air. Between the work and her world there was a string of small courtesies. An umbrella passed on a sudden drizzle, a sweatshirt offered against the wind, a hand extended when an uneven plank tried to pitch her forward. None of these gestures were declarations, yet together they built a kind of architecture beneath the careful plans of her life. They were scaffolding for something that might be built if both agreed. There was an evening, small and domestic, that became one of the steel frames of whatever was beginning. Marcos cooked dinner at his apartment, a modest place with a sink that didn't drain perfectly, and a balcony with tomato plants. The smell that filled the small rooms was garlic and tomato, and the radio was soft enough to be company but not to intrude. Luia recited a poem she'd learned in school, and Marcos listened with the rapt attention of a person who measured success in small things. Paola watched them. The scene was not meant for her, yet she was in it like light slipping through a window. Later, in the apartment building elevator, an old car with a slow cough and a sense of humor, Paola found herself pressed beside Marcos and Luia. A power surge stalled the elevator between floors. The lights flickered and then steadied. They were suspended for a long minute, the kind that makes small talk feel like an invasive species. Luia opened a wrapped sandwich she insisted on bringing and offered a piece to Paola. It was nothing special, cold slices of ham, a smear of mustard. It tasted of an ordinary life Paola had never measured her appetite for. They laughed about the sandwich, about the absurd gravity of being stuck between floors. Marcos leaned his shoulder against the wall, and without any ceremony, brushed the dust from Paola's coat with the back of his calloused hand. The motion was fatherly, banal, intimate. Paola felt an odd peace at the contact. It was not a spark of romantic confession so much as a recognition that someone could touch her without it being a transaction. In the weeks afterward, small revelations accumulated like dust, tracked into a pristine foyer. She learned that Marcos had taken night classes in carpentry after his wife left. That Luia liked to press her forehead to the glass and announce which clouds were ships. That his mother, Donna Lourdes, made the best rice and beans in the community, and that he called her weekly to make sure she was all right. Each detail did something to the shape Paola had assumed about herself. The heiress who was complete by virtue of independence. If completion had once been an armor, it was now showing seams. One night, after a long day of arguments over materials and mock-ups, Paola found herself at Marcos's side watching the sun drop through the bones of the mansion. The crew had left in a hush, tools organized into neat lines like soldiers at rest. The world had a residue of heat. A breeze washed through the scaffolding, carrying the smell of sawdust and the metallic tang of fresh nails. For a moment, nothing needed to be done except to be present. She moved closer. He glanced at her but didn't step back. The moment was thin and dangerous in its normalcy. Paola reached for his hand, not for power, not to test him, but almost involuntarily. His fingers closed around hers with a firmness that held, not controlled. She felt the map of work in his palm, a geography of lines and repairs, and it called to something in her she hadn't named. "Don't kiss me for sport," Marcos said then, and the warning was not abrasive. It was a principle, like a post marking the boundary of lands. "I don't kiss without intent." The word stopped something inside her like a gate. She had been used to having arrangements bend to her will. She was not used to being told, calmly and with kindness, what was and what was not possible. Paola laughed, a small, startled sound. "You make rules," she said, leaning into the warmth of his palm. He smiled at that, an expression that softened the lines around his eyes. "I make rules because my life needs them," he said. "My child needs them. I've seen what happens when you swap your head for a promise and call it safe." "You're impossible," she said, and the annoyance had the texture of affection. "Maybe," he answered, "but I'm not negotiable when it comes to the people I love." There was a tenderness in the way he said it. Paola felt something in her chest recalibrate, as if a scale that had measured only power now had room for other weights. She wanted to argue, to insist that love could be bought with grand gestures, or that sometimes rules could be reinterpreted. But the sound of his voice and the steadiness in his hand made her mute. The next days unfolded as a sequence of small tests. Paola asked about the schedule, gently steering the conversation toward architecture and procurement as a cover for wanting to be near him. She attended safety briefings not as an overlord, but as an understudy, and the men who had initially sized her up as a foreign object began to include her in a kind of exchange. That inclusion more than any signature, was intoxicating. At a company lunch, one of her advisors raised an eyebrow about the time she spent at the site. "You're being photographed," Lucas warned in a whisper. "The board expects focus. Your father—" He stopped. He always stopped short at saying the name that mattered. Augusto Andrade was a slow-moving force, a guardian of the family's treaties. He admired power the way others admired art, both for its beauty and its ability to survive scrutiny. Paola had long ago learned the contours of how he might react. There would be a calculus, an unspoken ledger. Love, if it counted in his books at all, would need to adhere to precedent. She told herself she could bear the ledger. She told herself the rules she'd been given were fine to bend, to reinterpret. But Marcos's rule, about intent and commitment, was not something she could fold into a corporate rewrite. His refusal to submit had nothing to do with arrogance. It had everything to do with dignity. One evening after a long day, Paola stood outside the crew trailer, watching Marcos as he signed off on deliveries. He was competent, the kind of man whose competence made the work look like an honest conversation with materials. He caught her looking and offered a half-smile, the kind that held no assumptions. She wondered if he realized how precisely he undid the calculations she had relied upon. He didn't have to. He simply went about being matter-of-fact in a way that showed a person could be stubborn without cruelty. Inside her bag, her phone chimed with a message from home, a reminder of the gala the next week, of reporters with cameras, of her father's expected presence. She typed a quick reply that said nothing, then looked up as Marcos wiped his hands with a rag and tucked it into his back pocket. The rag smelled of oil and citrus cleaner, a smell that registered in a different part of her brain than the scented mists of her perfume. It lodged there like a new color she wasn't sure she liked or disliked yet. Paola had conquered boards and markets, but this man, this foreman with dirt under his nails and a child who trusted him like an island, refused to act the way the world expected. He had not bowed. He had not begged. He had not accepted what money could guarantee. He had only asked in small, precise ways to be seen as someone who could resist being ordered. She imagined, in a daring slant of fantasy, instructing him to capitulate, telling him, with the ineffable power she wielded, to abandon his little rules and accept a life she could furnish in marble. The image made her laugh, low and disarmed, because the idea was both seductive and hollow. She had always been able to get what she wanted with a signature, and the temptation to try the same here was strong because it was new. But when she pictured that capitulation, it was no longer attractive. The thought of him, dulled by acquiescence, filled her with a small grief she hadn't expected. She stood there on the edge of the site, the world between them a collage of cables and plans, and for the first time in her life she considered the possibility that the thing she wanted could demand sacrifice, not as a loss of agency, but as a relinquishment of roles that had become comfortable and shapeless. She could step down without surrendering self. She could choose differently and still remain whole. The site closed for the weekend. Paola left with her heels slightly scuffed and a file of notes that she could not decide were professional or personal. Lucas called that evening to remind her of logistics. "Don't get distracted," he said. "This is a venture that needs your full attention." Distracted by what? She asked, and the question sat between them like a test. "By anything that isn't the work," he said. "You know how your father will be." She did know, but as she turned her phone off and stepped into the elevator, she replayed the image that had lodged in her. Marcos, holding Luia, the hard hat handed like an offering, the slow, quiet way he kept his promises to the people who mattered. The man who wouldn't submit to her authority had not set out to challenge her life's order. He had merely persisted in being the kind of person who refused to compress his love into a format for purchase. Something in her loosened at that persistence. That night she dreamed she was in a room with two doors, one carved of oak and brass, and the promises she'd always kept, the other of rough pine and a key she had not yet learned how to turn. She woke still holding the shape of choice. If you love unexpected romances, where two very different people teach one another how to live, subscribe. There's more to their story ahead. The week that followed a ripple of small changes. Paola found herself defending crew requests in meetings, persuading procurement to allow extra time for proper drainage. She did it with the smooth voice she had perfected, but the impulse came from somewhere that had nothing to do with returns. Lucas watched, baffled and a little pleased. Inside his reaction was the calculation that this new crease in her habits might be a liability or an asset. At the sight, Marcos watched her too, from a distance that was curious and wary. He had seen admirers before, women and men who lingered at the edges, who admired the look of authority as one admires a sculpture. Paola was different because she used her authority in a way that sometimes eroded her distance. She came to the crew with questions, with a willingness to listen that was rare. It kept him on balance. It made him suppose, dangerous business to suppose about a woman like her, that maybe her power had cracks. One afternoon, a delivery truck misjudged a turn, and a stack of plywood began to tip toward a group of junior workers. The scene was the kind of accident that could have made headlines in a small community, the kind of thing that exposes mistimes and miscalculations. Marcos moved first, as he always did. But this time Paola moved too. She yelled a warning, and in the same half-breath he grabbed a plank and held it until help arrived. Her hands had steadied the wood, where his had already taken purchase. There was an economy of motion between them, like two people who had learned to breathe in tandem. They both froze afterward, the sound of the truck receding, the tape on the ground fluttering. Her breath came faster than she liked. He looked at her, and there was something like approval in his eyes. Quiet and earned, not offered for sale. "You're reckless," he said without scolding. "In a good way." "And you're stubborn," she replied. "Also, in a good way." They laughed then, short and shared, the kind of laugh that tightens a knot between people who know something about each other. For all the power she wielded, for all the elation that came from having things bend to her vision, there was a new kind of hunger that had nothing to do with acquiring. It was the hunger to be known, to be tested against someone who would stand fixed and not crumble at the sound of her name. That night, alone in her apartment that looked out over glass towers and a city that slept in the neat lines of light, Paola took off her shoes and walked barefoot along a rug, thinking of hands. Hands sculpted the world. Hands that signed contracts. Hands that measured joists. Hands that held children. She thought of her own hands, manicured and precise, and of Marcos's, knuckled and honest. She imagined them working together the way machines sometimes mesh when two gears are the same size. But there was a principle that lay between them like a foundation beam. Marcos would not be ordered. He would not submit to authority the way others did. He had raised boundaries for reasons that had everything to do with his life and the people he protected. She could not purchase that unwillingness, nor would she want to. It was, irritatingly and humbling, part of what drew her. And so a new game, uncharted and fragile, began. She would try to learn his rules. He would try to see what it meant for someone with power to step back without being diminished. Neither knew yet if the architecture they might build would stand in the weather to come. At the center of it, Luia laughed at cartoons and asked the kinds of questions kids do, like whether the moon is made of cheese. Paola answered with the kind of patience she had used in diplomacy, and instead of feeling condescending, she felt amused. Marcos watched those moments, and in them, something like trust grew between them, small as mortar setting but steady. One evening, under the skeletal roof of the future North Wing, Paola stopped Marcos on his way to inspect the foundation. It had been raining and the dirt had turned slick. Her heel slipped on the edge of a board. For a heartbeat, she fell forward toward a depth that could have been a bruise, an injury, the kind of embarrassing catastrophe her life seldom offered. Marcos was there in the same breath, an arm, iron and warmth, wrapping across her waist. He steadied her without fanfare, without a word. Their faces were close enough that she could smell the faint trace of coffee on his breath, the dust in his hair. "You should wear boots," he said, voice even, as if the rescue had been as ordinary as fixing a misaligned tile. She straightened, cheeks awash with a flush she could not entirely name. "I can't wear boots to every meeting," she said, half joking, half not. "Some of us are required to look the part." He gave a crooked smile that might have been a laugh. "Some of us are required to build the part." That night, Paola dreamed of an unfinished house with 2 doors, both slightly ajar. One was carved and varnished, the other raw and open. She woke with the taste of metal and orange peel in her mouth. The narrative between them was still forming. There were rules and refusals, moments of touching and the gentlest of sparring. He was a man who wouldn't submit to her authority, not because he despised power, but because he preserved his own. She was a woman used to being obeyed, learning for the first time that to be loved might mean negotiating rather than commanding. The day closed around them like dusk, a warm hush settling on the site. Paola stood watching the silhouette of workers returning home, hands stained, boots heavy. She thought of the life she could offer, of how she could, if she chose, rewrite the script. But in the quiet that followed the day's labors, the image that remained was not of wealth altering a man, but of 2 people building something together, line by line, rule by rule. It was an image of partnership, fragile and luminous. She did not know yet whether the project would survive her father's scrutiny, corporate gossip, the inevitable misread intentions that come when worlds collide. She only knew that Marcos had refused to be ordered, and, paradoxically, that refusal had become the most honest invitation she had received in a long time. A week later, an envelope arrived at the site office, stamped with a company seal and bearing the weight of small but consequential threats. It lay on the desk, like a rumor given form. Paola picked it up with fingers that trembled in a way they rarely did. The paper was not the first obstacle they would face. It was only the beginning of a list that would test what either of them were willing to renounce. She slipped it into her bag, without opening it. Her life of certainty had always included reading what was coming before it arrived. Now she found herself hesitant, the way one is before pressing a button that changes an entire building's lights. She thought of Marcos and of the rule he had stated that night. No kisses without intent. She thought of Luia and the small, resonant ways the life she promised would have to alter to include them. She thought, with a dangerous tenderness, that she might be willing to learn the rules the hard way. As she left the site, her heels sunk again into the gravel. Dust rose, taking back the scent of her perfume and replacing it with the honest smell of labor. Marcos watched her go with a look that was neither asking nor conceding. She walked away with the envelope hidden against her hip and something like a resolve sitting heavy and unfamiliar in her chest. The day she met him had not settled into a simple narrative. Instead, it had opened into a question. And if a single moment could mark the fracture of a life's assumptions, it was this. The discovery that someone's refusal to submit could be the very thing that made love worth learning how to ask for. The envelope rested in Paola's lap like a small, deliberate accusation. She had tucked it between her phone and a sketch of the North Wing, fingers still smelling faintly of coffee from the site trailer. The seal carried a firm stamp and the kind of authority that had rarely looked her in the eye before. It was a legal notice, a complaint lodged anonymously, a demand for an internal review, a suggestion, unspoken but explicit, that her continued presence on the project posed a potential conflict of interest. The language was cold and precise. It suggested suspending her oversight pending investigation. She read it once, then again, eyes skimming for some error she could exploit, some phrase she could reframe. The lawyery, passive voice left no easy opening. She had dealt with regulatory notices, with investors' tempers, with the paranoia of markets that moved faster than people's hearts. This, though, nibbled at a seam she had rarely shown in public. The private life that people in her circles assumed would be curated, not messy. Lucas called that afternoon with the thin, practiced worry of a man who managed emergencies by way of spreadsheets. "Her father wants to talk," he said. "Augusto's on his way to your place tonight." Paola numbered the beats in her head. A father meeting, an envelope like a landing strip, the small war that always accompanied the acknowledgement of what you could not control. Inside, something tightened, not with fear, but with the peculiar clarity that comes when a plan needs rearranging. Augusto Andrade arrived without flourish. A late-model sedan, pressed suit, watch that had seen 3 generations of company meetings. He was as steady as marble and twice as unyielding. The house that now felt uncertain under Paola's feet hummed with a history he embodied. Conversations that became policy. Quiet commands that rippled into org charts. He had not yet met Marcos, though Paola had told him enough about the site for him to catalogue risk. He sat across from her, fingers steepled, eyes like a man accustomed to weighing futures on a balance. "You know what this looks like," he said without preamble. His voice had the same deliberate cadence he used in boardrooms. "There are optics. Investors are uneasy. If there are any improprieties, real or perceived, the board will act." "I did not file any complaints," Paola said, "and I have not let my personal life affect decisions here." "You are young enough to think bravery comes without consequences," Augusto replied. "You must choose. Either you step back from the project, take a leave of absence until this is settled, or we bring in a neutral party to oversee the North Wing. If the board loses confidence, you might lose your position on this development." He did not use the language of disinheritance. That would have been crude. Instead, he threatened reputational control. Within the family, such a thing might be worse than a public confrontation. It was a pressure on identity, an erosion of the authority she had been taught to wield. He leaned forward, eyes searching for softness. "This isn't an order because I want to order you," he said. "It's a measure to preserve what will happen if this becomes public." Paola listened. She thought of the envelope, the anonymous accusation, the board's possible reaction. She thought of the crew on the site who now relied on her decisions to get paid, the subcontractors whose schedules threaded into other families' paychecks. She thought of Marcos and Luia, of a child who laughed as if the world should be simple and safe. Choosing, she realized, would not be a simple prioritization of heart over work. It would be reckoning with the architecture she had inherited. "What do you expect me to do?" she asked, not from defiance but from the clarity that had become her practice when facing other men's certainties. "Step away from the active leadership," he said. "Let someone else sign the daily reports. You can be involved. But public perception is as important as reality." He framed the option as a strategy, a prudence. It was framed to be palatable. But Paola had watched too many people in her life reduce loyalty to calculations. She had spent long evenings convincing herself that she could bend the world to her will, and some small part of her had believed she could bend this man, Augusto, to compassion. Instead, she felt an unfamiliar revolt rise that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with truth. If she stepped back to protect a title, she would be protecting the world that had taught her to command rather than choose. It would be a paper shield without real consequence. "I won't hide," she said at last. Her voice was even. "If the board wants to open an investigation, let them. But I will not step away to avoid the truth of what I am choosing." Augusto's jaw tightened. An old, patient thing that betrayed both surprise and a slow, predatory calculation. Then understand this, he said. If the company's board reaches a conclusion you do not like, you may find some doors closing. I am not making threats, Paola. I am making you aware. She looked at him, and what she saw there was not cruelty so much as the arched certainty of a man who had always believed the right answer was compliance with his view of the world. It was not enough to shake her now. She had long rehearsed rebellion in shallow ways, charitable initiatives, risky corporate bets. But this request required a different kind of surrender. It would mean stepping out of the company circuits that insulated her. That night, after the conversation, she went back to the site alone. The lights were down to a few beacons, the scaffolding shadows like ribs against the sky. In the trailer, a coffee cup waited empty where Marcos had left it. She sat on an overturned bollard and thought of envelopes, of legal threats, and of something else she could imagine sliding across a table. A simple instrument of partnership, deeds, signatures that reallocated power in a way that made room for dignity. She made a decision there under the open sky. It was not dramatic. It required no public resignation or statement. She would withdraw from the corporate machinery that permitted power to be wielded as a weapon. She would not step away from the site or from the people whose work she had an obligation to protect. Instead, she would renounce a piece of her authority by stepping down from executive control of the specific development and forming an independent firm that would partner with the Andrade holdings on terms that prioritized labor, safety, and shared governance. It was a complicated move, legally, fiscally, socially, but it was a choice she could make that wouldn't feel like buying anyone. She could not grant Marcos the right to feel safe by purchasing his silence or his affection. But she could create a structure that honored what he valued: respect for labor, transparency, and the right of workers to have a voice in the places that affected their lives. The next morning she told Lucas and Gustavo nothing of the legal paper that had landed like a shrapnel. She told them instead that she intended to file the paperwork to form a new company, Silva and Andrade Construction, a joint venture with its own charter that required profit sharing and worker representation. Lucas's face toggled between alarm and guarded curiosity. Gustavo, quieter, slid into the language of risk analysis like a person who saw opportunity when others saw chaos. "You're serious?" Lucas asked, incredulous. "This will look like you're giving up ground." Paola breathed. "It will look like I'm changing how we measure ground. If the board wants drama, they'll get it. But I am not giving up my life to prove I've never wanted anything that could be measured by a signature." He tried to warn her about headlines and audits and the smell of a scandal. She told him she understood the risks. If he had wanted the position, he might have hesitated to support her. But his loyalty, complicated, businesslike, was not blind. He agreed to draw the initial documentation, less because he thought it safe, and more because he thought she was finally willing to test what she claimed to care about. Paola did not tell Marcos the plan immediately. She knew how invitations could be misread, how grand gestures could be reduced in the mind of a man who refused to feel purchased. She wanted the offer to stand on its own. Not a bribe, not a sweetener, but a proposal for a new company whose governance would require her to cede some of the levers she had always held. On the site, life kept moving with the stubborn rhythm of work. Boards arrived, nails were hammered. A small boy learned to throw a rivet into a bucket by feeling the weight of it. Marcos continued to be steady, insistent about safety, resistant against shortcuts that promised speed over durability. He had noticed, of course, that Paola had been quieter about the gala, and that she spent nights drafting plans instead of attending dinners. He had not yet imagined she would go public with a reconfiguration that would bind her to the kind of work he respected. Days blurred into a mode where they saw each other in the margins, quick conversations during deliveries, a sandwich split between shifts, a laugh shared over an absurd joke about a miscounted order. But there was a distance, a polite architecture of restraint that Marcos maintained. He had been offered envelopes before, men with cleaner suits than the ones he worked under offering him maps out of his life. He had refused them every time, not from arrogance but because a check could never repair the things his life depended on: dignity, trust, and the promise he made to Luia that they would not trade integrity for ease. One afternoon, as he tightened bolts on a support beam, a man in a pressed suit approached the trailer. He carried a small leather folder and a smile meant to be nonchalant. The men on site recognized the kind of person whose world moved with different rules. They watched with the cautious curiosity of an immune system. "You're Marco Silva?" the man asked. He looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Who wants to know?" The man introduced himself as a consultant for Andrade Holdings and, with the casual arrogance of a courier delivering mercy, he laid an envelope on the table. Inside were pages, an offer for a contract, a position at a subsidiary with a salary that would change their lives, a clause that required Marcos to distance himself from Ms. Andrade. It was careful, the language legal and soft. The implication was clear: accept, and the pressure on Paola might ease. Marcos read it once, then twice. He thought of his mother and of the way his hands had never felt the weight of unearned currency as something to be held easily. He had learned restraint by doing the thing that would make the next day safer for his daughter. He eyed the envelope as one might examine an invitation written in a language you did not accept. He folded the pages with slow, precise fingers and slid them back into the man's folder. "We don't make deals about people," he said. "You can tell your clients we do our work for a living, not to be moved like chess pieces." The consultant tried the soft sell, the one designed to make the target feel lucky. Marcos listened, then shut the deal with a single sentence. "Tell them there's nothing they can buy here that would be worth the cost of my word." The man left with his folder light, and his expression slightly discomfited. The crew around Marcos exhaled, as if a pressure had been released. They had been watching not just for the money but for the truth in how men responded to offers that could erase their dignity. Paola learned of the envelope only later, when a foreman told her that a man in a suit had left and that Marcos had refused a contract. She went to find Marcos at the far edge of the foundation, where he was checking anchor bolts. She watched him working, hands steady, focused, aware of the way the concrete took and held. The sight had in it the simple honesty she had fallen for, mastery grounded in devotion. She stepped into the light and, without prelude, told him about the company she had started to file: Silva and Andrade. The name itself was a kind of gauntlet thrown at both their worlds, a merging that carried risk. He paused, looking at her as if cataloging what this new name meant. "You're serious about it being a partnership?" he asked. The words were small, as if the idea needed the economy of understatement. "I am," she said. "Not as a facade, not as a PR move. I want a charter that guarantees workers a seat at the table, actual representation, shared profits, and oversight mechanisms so we can't shove people aside when it's inconvenient. I want the company to be about building communities, not just mansions." She waited, watching him process. He had the look of a man who took principles out and turned them over before deciding if they fit. "Why would you give up control?" he asked. It wasn't accusation so much as curiosity. "Because control has not given me the thing I thought it would," she replied, "and because I don't want to be the kind of person who fixes things with money." He studied her, the tilt of her jaw, the way a faint line had appeared between her brows, an echo of nights spent composing documents. "If this is true," he said slowly, "then prove it." She handed him a sheet of paper, a draft charter, lines inked with conditions she wanted. It was earnest and imperfect and read like someone trying to step into a language she was still learning. It required shared governance, audits conducted by third-party trustees, a commitment to hiring apprentices from local neighborhoods, and a clause that required any partner to forfeit certain executive rights in specific projects. Small, symbolic, but concrete. Marcos read it in silence. He was wary. He had seen gestures before. He had seen companies promise community and then shift like buildings in a storm. But the documents were not just ceremonial. They carried legal language, signatures lines, and a clause that demanded transparency. "I don't want a charity," he said, the word a boundary. "I want work that respects me, and I don't want you to think you can fix things that way so you feel less guilty. If you come into my world, come to stand with us." "Stand with us," she repeated. The phrase was a small key she turned in her mouth. She added quietly, "I'd rather be with you than anywhere else." He looked up. For a long moment his face was a closed thing. Then he reached for her hand. His palm held the familiar geography of labor, little scars, the map of a life earned. He did not take the paper as a proof, but as a gesture he would weigh against the lived truth of her actions. "There are things I can't accept from you," he said. "A check, a name on a building that erases the people who did the work. But there are things I can accept. Respect, a promise in ink that you don't walk away when the cameras leave." She nodded. "Take your time." They did not celebrate. The relationship was not sealed by a single embrace. Instead, they walked the site together, checking bolts and drainage, discussing the apprenticeship program she wanted to fund. She listened when he explained why certain anchors mattered more than renderings. He listened when she talked about fundraising and legal structures. It was partnership as practice, two people learning how to let authority be mutual. The presence of her father's pressure continued like a distant storm. The board issued a procedural review. Journalists whispered at the edges, but she had an anchor that did not depend on the board's smile. Then the ultimatum arrived in a different form. A formal letter from Andrade Holdings' legal team, blunt in tone. If Paola continued to publicly associate her name with the site in a way that could be construed as undue influence, the company would separate her from certain assets until the review concluded. It was not a threat of disinheritance. It was a measure of corporate leverage that sought to nudge behavior without drama. Paola stared at the words and felt a tenderness for the life she had. It was not that she loved boardrooms more than people. It was that her identity had been built within them. To renounce a piece of authority was to divide herself into shards and choose which pieces she wanted to glue together differently. She called Marcos. He was at the site, elbows deep in a plan, surrounded by the mild chaos of work. Luia ran by in a cape she'd fashioned from a tarpaulin, declaring herself queen of the foundation. Marcos listened as Paola explained the letter and, with little ceremony, said she intended to sign over certain responsibilities and move her focus into the new venture. "You sure?" Marcos asked. His voice held the soft caution of a man who had learned to be practical about promises. "Yes," she said, "because I want this to be real, and because I want to make a choice that can't be undone by a boardroom memo." He exhaled, a sound that might have been relief. "Then whatever you decide, I want your proof to be in how you live it." They both knew proof would be slow. Proof would be the salaries paid on time, the safety briefings done thoroughly, the transparent audits she insisted on. Proof would be having Luia sit in a meeting while adults discussed things with language she could understand, a gesture of real inclusion. Proof would be Paola showing up for the long, unglamorous work of changing structures. For a while, the world allowed them a cautious truce. They met for late dinners, simple meals in Paola's temporary flat above a bookshop, or in the small kitchen of Marcos's apartment, where Donna Lourdes fussed over pots and scolded the adults for staying out late. There were small intimacies. Paola learning how to knead dough when Donna Lourdes showed her, the smell of garlic and tomato becoming a scent that anchored her as surely as any perfume had before. The relationship deepened in slate-gray increments. They were not lovers in the swift, cinematic collapse of passion. They were two people arranging their lives to fit the contours of each other. Intimacy came in patient forms. Marcos showing Paola how to use a chisel properly, Paola helping Luia with homework, their hands sometimes meeting over a sink or in a doorway, and resting there as if deciding what to build next. Yet the pressure from the outside did not relent. Gossip blossomed. Board members sent terse notes. Photographers lurked too often at events where Paola once commanded the stage. The legal review dragged like winter. People who thrived on spectacle whispered bets on whether she would fold. When the pressure crescendoed, Paola made the first irrevocable move. She formally submitted her resignation from the day-to-day executive role, overseeing the Andrade Development Division, while retaining an advisory title. The move was carefully worded. She retained a seat on the board, but agreed that some operational controls would be transferred to an independent management team. It was not the dramatic divorce her father might have wanted. It was, instead, a reallocation of power that she shaped herself. Marcos was listening when she told him. He did not erupt in praise or speech. He simply reached out and pressed his thumb into the side of her hand, a small human gesture. It was not approval as transaction, but recognition that she had chosen to rework the scaffolding of her life. "You did it your way," he said. "I didn't want it to be just a gesture," she replied. "I want to learn how to be smaller in some rooms and larger in others." He smiled at that, quick and soft. "Then be smaller in the rooms that need less drama. Be larger where work needs someone who knows how to move systems." Months passed. The joint venture took shape tepidly at first, and then with the momentum of real labor. Silva and Andrade's charter was signed. It held clauses they had debated in the trailer and in late-night calls, worker representation on the board, profit-sharing schedules, apprenticeship quotas, and a community reinvestment fund. Paola funded the initial capital not as a gift, but as a seed investment governed by the charter she had drafted. It was structured to prevent unilateral withdrawal, a legal scaffold that matched their ethical one. Marcos remained skeptical of spectacle. He had seen too many projects promise the earth and return a billboard, but the company paid fair wages. They hired apprentices from local neighborhoods. They held town meetings where the residents were consulted about what a development should be. When a reporter asked if this was a PR move, Paola spoke plainly. "You can ask me that every week. My answer will be in the payroll." The work was not easy. There were setbacks, delayed permits, weather that postponed foundations, a subcontractor who tried to cut corners. There were arguments between Paola and Marcos, sometimes about money, sometimes about language, sometimes about trust. Once, in a meeting where a vendor tried to upsell a cheaper scaffold that cut safety margins, Marcos rose and walked out, muttering something about principle. Paola followed, furious and tender in equal measure, and the conversation that followed, under the skeletal shade of a half-built wall, became one of their deepest. "You can't do this for me," he said, voice tight. "I won't be used to make a point." "I'm not using you," she answered. "I'm trying to build a life that would be possible with you in it." They did not solve it in a single sentence. The work of weaving two disparate worlds into one fabric took months, not declarations. There were times they both considered retreat, times when Paola's father sent quiet shot across the bow, or when a column needed reworking and the budget ballooned. But each time, there was a mutuality that saved the moment. Marcos would not accept a bribe. Paola would not buy silence. Both insisted on doing the slow math of trust. Finally, there was a moment that felt like a hinge. The partnership had become not just a novelty, but an enterprise that delivered tangible benefits to the neighborhood, stable jobs, a small community center under construction, a promise that apprentices would be offered permanent positions. The crew, those who had watched the two of them stumbling toward a shared language, saw the result. It was in the paid wages, in the safety logs, in the way Donna Lourdes' rice was sometimes served at the crew site lunch as a celebration. On a warm afternoon, the site buzzing with the comfort of progress, Marcos called a short meeting by the foundation, where a framed photo of the original renderings sat in the project manager's trailer. The crew gathered, men and women who had developed a private fondness for the unlikely pair who had changed the script. Paola arrived, expecting perhaps a routine status update. Instead, Marcos took a piece of rebar in his chalk-dusted hands, rubbed it absently, and then addressed the small crowd. "You've seen us both try and fail and try again," he began. His voice was steady. "You've shown me what it's like to trust people with what's important, and you all know my rules. I don't do things because they're pretty. I do them because they're right." He looked at Paola. The air between them was quiet as a hinge. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring. Plain, a piece crafted from reclaimed metal from the site, filed and finished by one of the apprentices. It was not polished to a glitter that broadcast wealth. It was a ring of work, of metal saved and made into something else. "You came into our world," he said softly. "You didn't make it yours by force. You learned how to stand with us, and I—" He sank to one knee on the dusty ground in front of a handful of men and women and the foreman's trailer. It was not dramatic so much as profoundly public. A man who refused to be bought, kneeling in front of the people who sustained him. "Will you marry me?" he asked. The question was simple, practical, laden with an old-fashioned promise to build alongside rather than to rule. Paola's breath hitched. The look on her face was a catalogue of everything the last months had taught her. The taste of humility, the thrill of being truly seen, the ache of renunciation that had led to something whole. She had rehearsed 100 speeches and none fit this moment, which demanded not rhetoric but a single immediate decision. She knelt too, closing the distance between them not out of surrender but because she wanted to meet his gesture at the same level. She reached for his hand and the ring, and when he slipped it on her finger it felt somehow exactly right. Too small for a palace, perfect for a life. "Yes," she said simply. The crowd cried out in that small, delighted noise that people make when someone they love has chosen a future they can believe in. The moment shifted the axis of them. It did not erase the work they had left, the decisions ahead, the critics who would keep watching. But it made the project of their life together visible. Later, when reporters asked about the proposal, Marcos shrugged and said, "We like to do things the way we build houses, solidly with people in mind." The wedding was nothing like the gala Paola's father might have preferred. It was a gathering of the people who had mattered. The crew, Donna Lourdes with a flower in her hair, Luia with a crown made of construction tape, a few neighbors, some clients who had come to see how the company operated, and Paola's small contingent, Lucas and Gustavo, who had been pulled into this orbit. Augusto Andrade did not give a speech. He watched from a distance with a posture that said he was not ready to stop being a sentinel. Yet he was there, because the rituals that preceded him still mattered to him enough to attend. They married in the half-finished shell of what had once been a rendering on paper, under a makeshift arch made from planks and a curtain of string lights. They exchanged vows that were not flowery promises, but simple commitments: to show up, to put safety and fairness ahead of profit, to listen when the other was tired, and to repair when they made mistakes. Luia flung confetti that stuck stubbornly to the cement. Paola's hands, manicured but now bearing a faint smear of plaster, reached for Marcos's calloused ones and held them with what felt like a covenant. The party that followed was garlic and rice and warm beer. People danced in work boots and creased dresses. There were toasts that were equal parts humor and reverence. In the face of cameras, and a world that once considered this union improbable, they had made a wedding that was entirely theirs. Humble, loud, improvised, and true. Time moved forward in the kind, unperformative way it does when two people build a life. The company, Silva and Andrade, began to take on its own gravity. It brought apprentices through their ranks, and some of those apprentices became foremen themselves. There were new projects that followed the same principles. A renovation that restored small homes for elderly residents, a community center designed with input from local families, and a fund that supported vocational scholarships. It was not a silver bullet transformation of the neighborhood, but it was steady work that paid rent and taught skills. Paola learned to be less enamored of the spotlight and more committed to the daily tasks that made the spotlight unnecessary. Marcos learned that not every offer was an affront to dignity, that some proposals could be a pathway to broader change if they were offered and accepted in ways that protected the people he cared about. Their mutual transformation did not dissolve their identities but layered them. Paola did not become small. Marcos did not become a blank canvas for triumph. They became partners in the truest sense, building standards, hiring wisely, safeguarding families. Donna Lourdes became the unofficial matriarch of the company's lunch table, doling out portioned wisdom with bowls of rice and beans. Luia grew, her questions sharpening into a curiosity about material science and architecture. She learned to measure with her hands and take pride when a wall lined up perfectly. Sometimes, when she curled at the edge of her father's knee, she would ask about the day he'd refused the envelope. He would tell her gently why some things are worth more than money. A promise kept, a name kept clean, a life kept honest. Months turned into years. There was a child, unexpected and welcomed in the slow, intimate way that such things arrive when two people finally make room for more. Paola felt the same tremor she had once felt on the site when Luia had nearly been hit. This time, it was the thrum of a heartbeat that would be theirs to guard. The baby's arrival brought new faces to their table and a new rhythm to their days. Late-night feedings instead of late-night contracts. Lullabies instead of investor calls. Augusto Andrade, who had watched from the edges, softened enough to attend a few community dinners. Awkward, yet present. He never admitted outright that he had miscalculated. He reserved those moments for his private ledger. But when he saw the look on Paola's face as she watched her child sleep in a modest crib rather than a gold-trimmed bassinet, there was something that looked like satisfaction in his eyes. Not the triumph he once sought, but the more complicated approval that comes from seeing the people you care for sustained in ways that mattered. The company name became a banner for a different kind of success, one measured in apprenticeship completions and stable families rather than glossy renderings. They renovated houses not to flip them for profit, but to preserve the dignity of the people who live there. When the media asked about their model, Paola and Marcos answered simply, "We build houses for people, not logos." On quiet evenings, when the site was sleeping and the city threw its light like soft confetti against the sky, Paola would sit on the kitchen counter of her modest home, shoes off, feet dusty, hair escaping the chignon she once deemed indispensable, and watch Marcos with their child in his arms. He would hum under his breath, a tune he had picked up from a radio on the trailer years ago. His hands, once the map of labor, were now also the hands that cradled a small head. They were both hands that had learned to construct and to comfort. She would think of the day she first met him. The black SUV, the chain-link fence, the hard hat with dust on its rim. She would remember the first time he refused the idea that authority equaled obedience, how that refusal had both irritated and intrigued her. Most days, she thanked some private luck that he had not been willing to be ordered, not because it made him hard to possess, but because it made him whole. Once, while their child slept and the house hummed with the safe, domestic sound of a home properly occupied, Marcos took Paola's hand and placed it on the countertop where they stored their keys. He traced the grooves of small dents and scratches in the wood, the marks of meals, of working late, of the lives that had pressed into it. "You remember those rules?" he asked, smiling. She smiled back. The one about no kisses without intent? He leaned forward and kissed her, a touch that was both familiar and chosen. I keep making new rules, he said, but the old ones hold up. They stood in the kitchen, hands entwined, tasting garlic and lemon and the quiet of a life that had been built rather than commanded. Outside, the sounds of the city threaded through the windows. Inside, the house was a small place of enough love, enough food, enough company, enough dignity. Years later, when the North Wing they had once argued about glittered in its new purpose, affordable units interlaced with communal spaces and a community center named for Donna Lourdes, Paola would sometimes stand with Marcos on the roof and look at the city the way she once looked at drawings. She no longer measured buildings by the sheen of their marble, but by the honest lives within. A young apprentice once asked Marcos, watching him work on a beam, "What's the best thing you've ever built?" Marcos set his wrench down, wiped his hands on his jeans and looked at the crew. He glanced over, finding Paola's eyes in the crowd, then at the child playing nearby. His answer was immediate and true. "Family," he said, "hands together." And in the end, the most beautiful structure they ever raised was neither an office tower nor a mansion. It was a daily life, bricks laid not by the authority of a single signature but by two hands that had learned to measure each other's spaces, to hold fast to principle and to soften where necessary. They had negotiated power and pride until they built something stronger, a partnership that honored both dignity and tenderness. If this story touched you, leave a comment sharing your favorite moment or tag someone who loves stories where two very different people teach one another how to build a life.